January 7, 1945. Belgium is locked in winter. Snow clings to the edges of muddy roads. The guns in the Ardennes have finally begun to fall silent, but the air inside Allied headquarters is far from calm. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery steps into a crowded room. He wears his black beret, twin badges fixed in place. His posture is relaxed, almost assured. Before him sit British and American war correspondents, notebooks open, pencils poised. They expect figures, maps, the measured language of victory sets and casualty counts. Montgomery has asked for this meeting himself. The Battle of the Bulge is over. Hitler's last gamble in the West has failed. The German armies are retreating, their strength broken in the snowbound forests of Belgium and Luxembourg. For 6 weeks, American soldiers have absorbed the shock of the assault, fought encircled, frozen, and outnumbered. Tens of thousands are dead, wounded, or missing. Now the war appears to be moving forward again. Montgomery clears his throat. He begins to speak calmly, deliberately, in the tone of a man explaining events already settled in his own mind. Within minutes, pens move faster. Shoulders stiffen. Something is going wrong. What is said in this room will not stay here, and before the day is over, it will threaten the unity of the Allied command at the most dangerous moment of the war. Because to understand why these words mattered, one must first understand the battle that made them possible. By the winter of 1944, the war in Western Europe appeared, on paper, to be nearing its end. Paris had been liberated in August. Brussels followed soon after. Allied armies stood along Germany's western frontier, their supply lines stretched but intact, their confidence high. Many commanders believed the Wehrmacht was finished as an effective fighting force. That assumption collapsed before dawn on December 16, 1944. Without warning, 30 German divisions surged out of the Ardennes forest, striking thinly held American positions in Belgium and Luxembourg. Snow, fog, and forest concealed their movement. Allied air power, normally decisive, was grounded by weather. The attack achieved near total surprise. American units on the line were under strength, some recently arrived from quiet sectors or refitting after earlier battles. Within hours, German armor and infantry punched through weak points, overrunning headquarters, cutting roads, and isolating entire regiments. Communication broke down.
Maps became obsolete by the hour. By December 18th, the situation was grave. A deep German salient, soon known as the Bulge, pushed nearly 60 miles into Allied lines. Bastogne was surrounded. Fuel depots and supply routes lay under threat. Most alarming of all was Antwerp, the vital port sustaining the Allied advance. If it fell, the entire campaign could stall. For the United States Army, this would become the largest and bloodiest battle it had ever fought. Over the next 6 weeks, nearly 89,000 American casualties would be recorded. In the opening days, there was confusion, exhaustion, and fear, but also stubborn resistance, as small units held crossroads and villages long enough to slow the German timetable. As the crisis deepened, the Allied command faced a problem no battlefield map could solve, because the German breakthrough had not only shattered front lines, it had split the Allied command structure itself, forcing a decision that would reverberate long after the snow melted. By December 20, 1944, the German penetration had torn a dangerous seam through the Allied front. The American line was no longer continuous. General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group, headquartered in Luxembourg, found itself cut off from key formations to the north. Telephone lines were unreliable. Radio traffic was overwhelmed. Orders took hours to move through a battlefield changing by the minute. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower faced a decision with no good options. U.S. Ninth Army under General William Simpson were effectively isolated from Bradley's control. Eisenhower concluded that for operational clarity, these armies had to be placed under a single headquarters closer to the fighting. That headquarters belonged to Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding the British 21st Army Group. The decision was temporary, it was practical, and it was explosive. Bradley objected fiercely. He had commanded these armies since Normandy. To him, the transfer was not merely administrative, it looked like a public verdict on American competence at the moment of crisis. He warned Eisenhower that it would be interpreted as a loss of confidence, both by the American public and by soldiers already under extreme strain. Eisenhower overruled him. Montgomery arrived at 1st Army headquarters on December 20 with the confidence of a man accustomed to command in chaos. He found American staffs exhausted, struggling to track unit locations across a fractured front.
Montgomery moved quickly. He ordered withdrawals to shorten lines. He consolidated defenses along the northern shoulder of the Bulge. British XX Corps was positioned as a strategic reserve behind American forces. These measures helped stabilize the situation. But even as the front began to harden, resentment quietly deepened. Montgomery described the battlefield as disorganized. His staff echoed the assessment. Word traveled. And while Montgomery secured the north, another American army was already moving, one that would soon define how the battle was actually decided, and how the story of victory would be fought over long after the shooting stopped. For the American soldiers in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge was not a maneuver problem or a command arrangement. It was survival. Infantrymen fought in sub-zero temperatures, foxholes dug into frozen ground. Many lacked winter clothing, weapons jammed, medics worked with numb hands. Entire units were cut off, resupplied by air when weather allowed, holding villages whose names would later become symbols: Bastogne, St. Vith, Elsinborn Ridge. These soldiers did not experience the battle as chaos in need of outside rescue. They experienced it as relentless pressure, met with stubborn resistance. Small unit leadership, junior officers and non-commissioned officers kept the line from collapsing in the critical first days. The human reality of the battle was paid for in frostbite, amputations, and graves carved into snow-covered fields. By January, when journalists began assigning credit, these men were still fighting or recovering. How the story of the battle was told mattered deeply to them, because it shaped how their sacrifice would be remembered. Bernard Montgomery had spent his career believing in clarity, order, and control. He distrusted improvisation. He valued methodical preparation and centralized authority. In North Africa, this approach had served him well. He had become a national symbol of British resilience and competence. Montgomery believed morale depended on narrative. Battles, in his view, needed clear explanations and visible leadership. When he took command of the northern sector, he saw disorder that offended his professional instincts. He believed he had imposed structure, and that structure had mattered. By January 1945, Montgomery felt entitled to explain events in his own words. He did not see this as arrogance. He saw it as responsibility.
By late 1944, the balance within the alliance had shifted. American forces now dominated the Western Front in numbers, logistics, and casualties. Britain, exhausted after 5 years of war, was increasingly a junior partner in material terms, but not in self-perception. This imbalance created tension. British leaders feared being overshadowed. American commanders bristled at condescension. The Battle of the Bulge placed that tension under extreme stress, and the way credit would be assigned threatened to turn quiet resentment into open rupture. All of these forces converged in one place, because the moment Montgomery chose to speak publicly, every word would carry more weight than he understood. Militarily, the Battle of the Bulge turned not on a single headquarters decision, but on time. German success depended on speed, on seizing bridges, fuel dumps, and road junctions before Allied reserves could react. That timetable was broken early by American resistance. Units that were supposed to collapse instead held. Others withdrew in good order, trading space for time. The decisive counterstroke came from the south. On December 19th, General George S. Patton executed a maneuver unmatched in scale and speed. He disengaged 3 divisions of 3rd Army, pivoted them 90 degrees, and drove north through snow and ice. On December 26th, Patton's lead elements reached Bastogne, breaking the encirclement of the 101st Airborne. By early January, American forces were attacking from both flanks, compressing the German salient. Montgomery's contribution, real but limited, was stabilizing the northern shoulder. British forces entered combat later, after the German offensive had already stalled. They fought effectively, but they did not determine the outcome. In 1945, newspapers were weapons. Headlines shaped public understanding of the war. British and American audiences read different papers, but they fought the same enemy. What appeared as confidence in one country could look like insult in another. Montgomery was speaking to reporters who would transmit his words across the Atlantic within hours. Subtle emphasis mattered, pronouns mattered, tone mattered. Once printed, those words could not be recalled. By January 1945, Allied commanders were running on fatigue as much as resolve. Months of campaigning, political pressure, and constant decision-making had narrowed tempers. Pride was fragile. Slights felt larger.
In that state, the difference between we and I could fracture trust. Montgomery did not account for this. He believed the facts would speak for themselves. Instead, they would ignite a crisis, because on January 7, 1945,
The battle shifted from frozen forests to a warm room filled with reporters, where the war would be fought with words instead of weapons. The room was quiet when Montgomery began. He spoke without hesitation, reading from prepared notes. He described the German offensive as a complex, demanding operation, one of the most interesting and tricky battles he had ever handled. The freezing passed at first, then settled heavily among the American correspondents. This was not a collective account. It was personal. Montgomery continued. He spoke of sorting out dispositions, positioning reserves, ensuring coherence. Each sentence reinforced the same idea. Order had been imposed where confusion reigned. He spoke almost entirely in the first person. He described how he had taken steps to ensure the Germans would never cross the Meuse, how he had deployed British forces carefully, deliberately, so as not to interfere with American lines of communication. Then came the line that sharpened every pencil in the room. British troops, Montgomery said, were now fighting on both sides of American forces who had suffered a hard blow. This, he concluded, was a fine Allied picture. To Montgomery, the statement was balanced: British support, American endurance, Allied cooperation. To the American reporters, the implication was unmistakable. The Americans had been hit hard, they had faltered, and a British commander had stepped in to organize the defense and secure the victory. When Montgomery briefly acknowledged American commanders, the contrast was stark. Bradley's operations were being handled well, now. Then Montgomery returned to describing his own dispositions and decisions. The conference lasted less than an hour. Montgomery left satisfied. The reporters did not. As they filed out, stories were already forming, not about German defeat, but about credit, pride, and insult. Within hours, headlines were hardened perceptions. Within a day, they would threaten the Allied command itself, because what Montgomery had framed as clarification was about to be received as appropriation. The reaction was immediate and violently divided along national lines. In Britain, the press embraced Montgomery's account with enthusiasm.
Headlines celebrated his calm leadership and decisive intervention. Articles emphasized that when the Americans had suffered a hard blow, British command experience had steadied the front. For a war-weary public sensitive to playing a secondary role, the story was reassuring. Montgomery was once again portrayed as the professional who restored order in crisis. Across the Atlantic, the same words landed like an accusation. American correspondents filed stories emphasizing Montgomery's repeated use of "I handled," his depiction of American forces as disorganized, and his marginal acknowledgement of Patton's relief of Bastogne. Editorials followed within hours. The tone shifted from confusion to anger. The best American army had ever fought was being publicly reframed as a British-managed rescue. In Europe, soldiers read the reports. Men who had frozen in foxholes and fought surrounded saw their effort reduced to a prelude for someone else's leadership. Stars and Stripes was scathing. Among American units, Montgomery became a symbol, not of cooperation, but of condescension. At his headquarters in Luxembourg, General Omar Bradley read the coverage in silence. He had tolerated Montgomery's manner since Normandy. He had swallowed the December transfer of his armies for the sake of operational necessity. This, to him, crossed a line. Bradley sat down and drafted his resignation as commander of the 12th Army Group. He informed his staff. They supported him. Other senior American generals made clear they would follow if he stepped down. What began as a press conference had become a command crisis. When Eisenhower learned what was unfolding, he understood the stakes immediately. If Bradley resigned, the consequences would extend far beyond military structure. Congressional outrage, public backlash, and alliance fractured in the final months of the war. Eisenhower asked Bradley for 48 hours. Then he picked up the phone to call Bernard Montgomery. Because unless this fire was contained, the Allied war effort itself could begin to unravel. Eisenhower's conversation with Montgomery was strained and direct. He explained that the press conference had triggered outrage among American commanders and troops. Resignations were being prepared. The unity of the command was in danger. This was not about tactics or credit, it was about trust. Montgomery was genuinely surprised. He insisted he had meant no insult.
He believed he had praised the Americans by calling the outcome a great Allied victory. He did not grasp how his emphasis, his phrasing, and his tone had been received. To him, the reaction seemed political, even oversensitive. Eisenhower pressed the point. It was not what had been said, but how it had been said. The repeated use of the first person, the implication that American forces required rescue, the cursory treatment of Patton's relief of Bastogne. Taken together, they formed a narrative American commanders could not accept. Reluctantly, Montgomery agreed to issue a clarification. But Eisenhower knew the damage was already beyond the military sphere. The crisis had reached London. Winston Churchill understood at once what was at stake. He had spent years cultivating American trust, knowing Britain's survival and eventual victory depended upon it. On January 18, 1945, Churchill rose in the House of Commons to speak about the Battle of the Bulge. Every word was chosen with care. This was not a battlefield speech. It was damage control at the highest level. Churchill praised American leadership explicitly. He emphasized that the fighting and the losses had been overwhelmingly American. He reminded Parliament and the world that it was American homes receiving the telegrams of death and loss. British contributions were acknowledged, but firmly placed in context. The speech worked. It signaled respect. It calmed tempers. But it could not erase what had already been said, because behind closed doors, Eisenhower still had to prevent a rupture among his own generals. Following Churchill's intervention, Montgomery issued his own clarification on January 21, 1945. It was carefully worded, emphasizing admiration for American soldiers and commanders. Yet even in this explanation, Montgomery's phrasing suggested subtle superiority. To American generals, the tone rang hollow. They knew he still believed he had handled the crisis. Eisenhower turned back to Bradley. He secured a promise. Montgomery would never again command American forces except in the most extreme emergency. Bradley agreed to withdraw his resignation. The immediate crisis had passed, but the scars were permanent. From that point onward, Montgomery's authority was limited. He commanded only British and Canadian formations. American generals, once tolerant of his mannerisms, now actively distrusted him. S units.
The alliance endured, but it was no longer easy. Formal correctness replaced camaraderie. Every public statement was scrutinized, every compliment measured for hidden meaning. Eisenhower's strategic flexibility suffered. The broad front approach into Germany in 1945 was driven in part by political necessity, ensuring Montgomery could not be seen as favored. Montgomery had sought to enhance British influence and his own reputation, but instead he diminished it. The press conference that lasted less than an hour had shaped the operational and political environment for months. The Battle of the Bulge had been won decisively by American initiative and sacrifice. Montgomery's press conference had almost undone that unity, revealing the fragility beneath the surface of Allied cooperation. Leadership, communication, and diplomacy, the tools as vital as rifles and tanks, had been tested in a single room with a handful of reporters. Montgomery's press conference is a reminder that wars are not won solely on the battlefield. Leadership extends beyond strategy and maneuver. It encompasses perception, respect, and timing. One man's attempt to clarify history became a test of alliance, trust, and patience. Words can be weapons as sharp as artillery. In January 1945, a few sentences nearly fractured the most critical partnership of the Second World War. Eisenhower's skillful diplomacy, Churchill's intervention, and Bradley's restraint preserved unity, but the episode left lasting tension. American generals would never view Montgomery in the same light, and British commanders learned the peril of public pronouncements. Montgomery never fully understood the impact of his words. He believed he had rescued the Americans from disaster, when in fact American soldiers, through endurance, improvisation, and audacious counterattack, had saved themselves. His press conference amplified ego over reality, emphasizing individual credit at the expense of collective sacrifice. In the end, January 7, 1945 serves as a quiet but powerful lesson. Leadership is as much about humility and timing as it is about decisiveness. Even in victory, the wrong words can threaten cohesion, and in the delicate architecture of alliance warfare, knowing when to speak and when to remain silent can be as consequential as the battles themselves. On that winter morning in Belgium, the pens of reporters almost reshaped history.
Instead, they illuminated a truth every commander must reckon with. The war is won not by one man's pride, but by the courage, sacrifice, and collaboration of many.